Picture this. You are standing not in a museum, gazing at artifacts behind glass, but on the sun-scorched earth of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization itself. The air is thick with the scent of baked clay, exotic spices from a bustling market, and the distant metallic tang of a blacksmith's forge. Before you, rising towards a sky of impossible blue, is a great ziggurat, a man-made mountain of brick, its steps seeming to ascend into the very realm of the gods. This is the land between the rivers, the fertile crescent, where humanity first dared to build cities, to write laws, to chart the stars. It is here that the foundations of our world were laid. We owe these people everything: our alphabet, our concept of time, our first epic poems. They were pioneers, thinkers, builders. And yet, if you were to walk from that bustling marketplace, past the scribes recording harvests and the soldiers polishing their bronze shields, and enter the sacred precinct at the heart of that very temple, you would witness a ritual so alien to our modern sensibilities. It might make your blood run cold. You would see something that we, in our enlightened age, would label as sordid, as exploitative, as a crime. But to the people of Sumer, of Akkad, of Babylon, it was something else entirely. It was holy. Inside the cool, shadowed halls of the temple, you would find women, and sometimes men, adorned not in the simple garb of the marketplace, but in fine linens, their eyes lined with kohl, their hair intricately braided and perfumed. They are not here to pray in silence. They are here to perform a sacred duty, a divine transaction that lies at the very heart of their understanding of the universe. They are here to offer their bodies to strangers in the name of the gods. This was not the shameful back-alley trade we associate with prostitution today. This was a form of worship, a spiritual calling performed in the most sacred space in the city, under the watchful eyes of the goddess of love and fertility herself, the great Inanna, or as she was later known, Ishtar. To understand this, you must first forget everything you think you know about sex. For the Mesopotamians, the act of intercourse was not merely a private, personal affair between two individuals, driven by love or lust. It was a cosmic drama, a reflection of the most powerful forces in the universe. It was the engine of creation. Their entire world was built upon a cycle of life, death, and rebirth. A cycle they saw mirrored in the changing seasons, the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates, and the sprouting of barley from the earth. Their survival depended entirely on the fertility of their land, their livestock, and their people. And who governed this potent, life-giving force? The gods. Specifically, the goddess Inanna Ishtar. She was not a gentle, nurturing mother goddess. She was a deity of terrifying dualities. She was the goddess of love, but also of war. She was the bringer of life, but also the harbinger of destruction. She was sensuous, passionate, and utterly untamable. To worship her was to embrace the raw, chaotic, and creative power of nature itself. Her mythology is filled with tales of her taking countless lovers, gods and mortals alike, and her desires were seen as a force of nature, as essential and powerful as a flood or a famine. So how does a society ensure the favour of such a potent and unpredictable deity? How do they guarantee that the rains will come, that the crops will grow, that their children will be healthy? They do it by honouring her in the most direct way imaginable. They participate in her sacred act. The rituals performed within her temples were a form of sympathetic magic. By enacting the sacred union on a human level, they believed they were encouraging the gods to ensure fertility on a cosmic scale. The act of a priestess joining with a stranger was a prayer made flesh, a physical appeal to the divine to bless the community with abundance. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, but describing what he understood to be a long-standing Babylonian custom, gives us a shocking account of this practice. He wrote that every woman born in the country must, once in her life, go and sit down in the precinct of Venus, that is, Ishtar, and there have intercourse with a stranger. He describes a scene of women sitting in the holy enclosure waiting. A man would walk by, toss a silver coin into her lap and say the words, "I demand you in the name of the goddess Melita," another name for Ishtar. She could not refuse. It did not matter if the man was handsome or hideous. The coin made the act sacred, and she was required to follow him and fulfill her duty to the goddess. Only after this act was she free to go home, her obligation met. Now, historians debate whether Herodotus's account was an exaggeration or a misunderstanding of a more complex reality. It may not have been every single woman, but perhaps a symbolic act performed by a few, or a practice that had changed over the centuries. But the core of the story, the idea that a sexual act with a stranger could be a sacred, compulsory duty, was not a Greek fantasy. It points to a fundamental truth about the Mesopotamian worldview, the profound, inseparable link between the sexual, the sacred, and the survival of civilization. These were not simply temple prostitutes in the way we would understand the term. Many were respected priestesses, the Naditu, who held significant social and economic power. They were literate, they could own property, and conduct business, freedoms denied to most other women of the time. Their role was not one of shame, but of honour. They were the living embodiments of the goddess's power, and their sacred duties ensured the cosmic balance upon which everyone depended. This was a society where the lines between the physical and the spiritual, the sacred and the profane, were not just blurred, but entirely non-existent. This public and religious embrace of sexuality stands in stark contrast to the often private, guilt-ridden, or purely transactional views that would come to dominate later cultures. But how did this sacred, public sexuality coexist with the rules of everyday life? How did a society that gave us the first written laws, like the Code of Hammurabi, with its strict penalties for adultery, navigate the complex world of marriage, family, and desire when the gods themselves demanded such seemingly contradictory acts of devotion? To find the answer, we must look deeper into the legal and social fabric of Mesopotamian life, where we find a system not of chaos, but of intricate and often brutal control. The answer to this seeming contradiction lies not in the passionate chaos of the temple, but in the cold, hard logic of a clay tablet. Imagine a stone pillar, nearly 7.5 feet tall, erected in a public square for all to see. Carved into its surface in the elegant, wedge-shaped script of cuneiform are 282 laws, a code so comprehensive it would govern every aspect of life, from the price of renting an ox to the penalty for a clumsy surgeon. This is the Code of Hammurabi, and it reveals a society obsessed not with spiritual freedom, but with order, property, and control. And nowhere is this control more absolute, more brutally defined than within the institution of marriage. To the Mesopotamians, marriage was rarely a matter of the heart. It was a business transaction, a strategic alliance between families. A marriage contract inscribed on a clay tablet and sealed by witnesses was a legally binding document that detailed the transfer of the bride from her father's house to her husband's, and she was, in essence, the most valuable asset in this transaction. The contract would specify the bride price paid to her father and the dowry she brought with her, which remained her property but was managed by her husband. It was a transfer of assets, a merger of family fortunes, and at its centre was the bride's chastity, the guarantee of legitimate heirs. A bride's virginity was not a moral preference, it was a non-negotiable term of the contract. Its value was paramount. If a husband discovered his new wife was not a virgin, he could legally dissolve the marriage, return her to her father in disgrace, and demand the dowry back. The family's honour, its social standing, and its economic future rested on the sealed vessel of the bride's body. Once that seal was broken by her husband, her fidelity became the cornerstone of the social order. The law was unflinching. Law 129 of Hammurabi's Code states it with chilling simplicity. If the wife of a man has been caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. Death by drowning for both the woman and her lover. There was no room for nuance, no plea of love or extenuating circumstance. It was a matter of property rights. A wife's sexuality belonged exclusively to her husband, because her womb was the vessel through which he would produce his heirs and continue his lineage. Any unauthorized use of that vessel was a theft against the entire family, a crime against the very structure of their society. But here is where the paradox deepens and the chilling logic of Mesopotamian patriarchy reveals itself. That same law, so absolute in its condemnation of a wife's infidelity, was completely silent on the husband's. A married man was free to have relations with slaves, concubines, or temple priestesses with no legal repercussions. His actions were not considered adultery because his fidelity was not the issue. The only crime a man could commit in this regard was to sleep with another man's wife. And even then, the crime was not against his own wife, but against the other husband whose property he had trespassed upon. So how could a society so obsessed with wifely fidelity simultaneously sanction religious prostitution? The answer lies in a masterful act of psychological and social compartmentalization. The sex that happened within the temple walls was not considered personal. It was not an act of love, desire, or betrayal. It was an impersonal, sacred ritual, a transaction not with the man, but with the goddess. The coin the stranger tossed into the woman's lap was not payment. It was an offering that sanctified the act, lifting it out of the mundane world of marriage contracts and property law and placing it into the cosmic realm of divine worship. In this context, the woman was not being unfaithful to her husband. She was fulfilling an obligation to her goddess, an act that was believed to bring blessings of fertility and prosperity to the very community and the very family that so strictly controlled her. The identity of the man was irrelevant. He was merely an instrument, a conduit for the divine energy. In the temple, a woman's body was temporarily no longer the property of her husband, but a vessel for the goddess Inanna. This separation of the sacred and the secular allowed the two contradictory systems to exist side by side. On the street, a woman's chastity was a matter of life and death, the bedrock of social order. But in the temple, her sexuality was a source of divine power, a tool for ensuring the survival of that very same order. It's a terrifying social and spiritual vertigo, a world where the most intimate act could be at once a capital crime and a sacred duty, depending entirely on where it was performed. But while the law codes and temple rituals tell us how the Mesopotamians tried to regulate and harness the power of sex, they don't tell us the whole story. What about love? What about desire, jealousy, and passion in their everyday lives? Did the cold calculus of marriage contracts leave any room for romance? The answer, surprisingly, is yes. And it's a story told not on stone pillars, but whispered in the lines of their love poetry and revealed in the surprisingly intimate details of their medical texts. Despite the ironclad contracts and the threat of a watery grave, the human heart, it seems, has always beaten with a rhythm of its own. To truly understand the Mesopotamians, we must turn away from the stone pillars of the law and listen to the whispers etched onto small, unassuming tablets of clay, hidden for millennia beneath the dust of forgotten cities. These are their love poems, and they are one of the most breathtaking discoveries in the history of archaeology, for they reveal a world of private passion, of tender intimacy, and of searing desire that feels shockingly, profoundly modern. What is astonishing is that many of these poems are written from a female perspective, giving us a rare and precious glimpse into the inner world of women in a society that so thoroughly sought to control them. These are not odes to marital duty or familial alliance. This is the raw, unfiltered voice of love. They speak of a lover's body with an unabashed, sensual delight. "My beloved, your charm is sweet. I have tasted your honey," one poem reads. The lover is a gazelle, swift and beautiful. His eyes are stars. His embrace is a garden of earthly delights. These are poems of yearning, of the ache of separation, of the thrill of a secret meeting in a reed hut by the riverbank, far from the prying eyes of the city. They speak of a love that is chosen, not arranged, a connection that transcends social standing and legal obligation. Here in these intimate verses, we find the other side of the Mesopotamian coin. If marriage was the rigid, public structure that held society together, then this passionate, personal love was the vibrant, chaotic life that pulsed within it. It was the force that the laws sought to contain, the desire that the rituals sought to channel. How could these two realities coexist? How could a young woman promised in a contractual marriage write with such passion about a secret lover? It tells us that then, as now, the human experience was a landscape of contradictions. They lived in a world of strict rules, but they also carved out spaces for personal freedom, for emotions that defied regulation. Their poetry was a rebellion of the heart, a testament to the fact that no law, no matter how severe, can ever truly legislate love. But their approach to the intimate lives of their citizens went beyond just the emotional. It was also intensely practical. Buried alongside the epic poems and legal codes archaeologists have found another remarkable set of documents, medical texts. And within these texts, we find detailed discussions and treatments for a range of sexual ailments. This wasn't a world of shame and silence when it came to sexual health. If there was a problem, it was seen as just that, a medical issue to be solved, not a moral failing to be condemned. Physicians, known as the ASU, and magical healers, the Ashipu, offered remedies for everything from impotence to infertility. A man struggling with what they called a loss of manliness wouldn't be met with ridicule, but with a prescription of ground herbs mixed with beer or a magical incantation to be recited at dawn. They understood that a man's ability to perform sexually was tied to his sense of self, his honour, and his duty to produce an heir. A couple unable to conceive would seek remedies ranging from herbal poultices to elaborate rituals designed to appease the gods and open the womb. They even had recipes for aphrodisiacs, concoctions of dates, pistachios, and other potent ingredients designed to stir desire. What these texts reveal is a society that took sexuality, in all its forms, incredibly seriously. It was not something to be hidden away or ignored. It was a fundamental aspect of human life, as vital as the harvest, and just as worthy of careful attention and intervention. It was a source of pleasure, a cornerstone of family, and a conduit to the divine. The Mesopotamians, it seems, were masters of compartmentalization. They created a complex system where sexuality could be a sacred duty in the temple, a contractual obligation in the home, and a source of profound personal passion in the secret spaces of the heart. They understood its power, and they sought to harness it, to regulate it, and to celebrate it in all its different forms. But for every force of creation, there is a shadow, a corresponding force of destruction. For all their attempts to order and sanctify the act of sex, the Mesopotamians were also terrified of its darker side. They believed that desire, if left unchecked or directed into forbidden channels, could open a gateway not to the gods, but to something far more sinister. It could attract the attention of demons, malevolent spirits that lurked in the shadows, waiting to feast on human life and vitality. And the most feared of all these supernatural predators was a creature born of the night, a seductress of unparalleled terror, a demoness whose name has echoed through the millennia, a name you might even recognise. Lilith. Her name is whispered, not spoken, a chilling sound on the night wind. She is the shadow that follows the goddess of love, the dark reflection of all that is fertile and life-giving. She is Lilith. In the Mesopotamian mind, if Inanna Ishtar represented the sacred, creative, and socially sanctioned power of sexuality, Lilith embodied its terrifying, untamed, and destructive potential. She was not a goddess to be worshipped, but a primordial terror to be feared and fought. She was the demoness of the night, a phantom of desire and death who slunk through the shadows of the sleeping world, a predator whose hunger was for the very essence of life itself. The ancient texts describe her as a creature of immense and terrifying beauty, with wings and the talons of a bird, a being of the air and the darkness. She was the nightmare lover who visited men in their sleep, seducing them in their dreams and stealing their seed. This wasn't just a moral panic about nocturnal emissions, it was a deeply held fear about the loss of vital life force. In a society where procreation was paramount, the spilling of seed for any reason other than creating a legitimate heir was a dangerous waste, an invitation to chaos. Lilith was the personification of that chaos, the embodiment of sterile, non-procreative desire. But her threat was not limited to men. She was also the snatcher of newborns, the phantom who crept into the birthing room to steal the breath of infants and to torment new mothers. A supernatural explanation for the terrifyingly common tragedies of stillbirth and sudden infant death syndrome. She was the ghost in the machine of creation, the force that sought to undo the sacred work of fertility. But Lilith was not alone. The Mesopotamians believed the world was teeming with sexually charged demons. There were the Lilu, the male counterparts to Lilith, who preyed upon women, and the terrifying Lamashtu, a lion-headed demoness who was even more monstrous than Lilith, feasting on the flesh of babies and drinking the blood of men. These were not abstract boogeymen. They were a constant and present danger. So how did you protect yourself from these nocturnal predators? How did a family safeguard its newborn child from the clutches of Lamashtu? The answer, once again, was ritual. They surrounded themselves with a spiritual arsenal of amulets, incantations, and magical rites. A pregnant woman would wear special charms inscribed with prayers to ward off evil. Newborn babies would have protective amulets tied around their wrists and ankles. Homes would be purified with incense, and special incantations would be recited to create a protective barrier around the bed. What this reveals is a society living in a state of constant, low-level anxiety about the spiritual dangers of their own bodies. Their sexuality was a source of immense power, but it was also a vulnerability, a gateway through which the forces of chaos could enter their world. They navigated their lives with a complex set of rules and rituals, a spiritual roadmap designed to keep the demonic at bay while still honouring the divine. The laws of Hammurabi controlled the social consequences of sex, but it was the incantations of the Ashipu that were believed to control its supernatural fallout. This obsession with controlling every aspect of human sexuality, from the legal to the magical, begs a crucial question. Beyond the high drama of the temple and the terror of demons, what did sex actually look like for the average Mesopotamian behind closed doors? The answer, found not in grand myths but in frank and sometimes shocking legal disputes and medical texts, reveals a sexual landscape far more complex, and in some ways far more permissive than we could ever imagine. The answer lies not in grand pronouncements from a king's throne, but in the thousands of clay tablets that document the messy, complicated, and intensely human realities of everyday life. On these tablets, we find marriage contracts, legal disputes, medical prescriptions, and private letters, and when pieced together, they paint a picture of a sexual landscape that defies our simple categories of repressive or liberated. Let's start with the question of premarital sex. Given the absolute legal and social importance placed on a bride's virginity, you would assume that any sexual activity outside of marriage was strictly forbidden and severely punished. And for respectable women of the upper classes, that was largely true. Their value was tied to their purity, and their lives were carefully managed to ensure that asset was delivered intact on their wedding day. But what about the rest of society? The evidence suggests a far more complex reality. For men, both unmarried and married, there was a vast and socially accepted landscape of sexual opportunity. Prostitutes, both secular and religious, were a regular feature of city life. Having relations with a slave woman you owned was considered a right. The law codes are almost entirely concerned with the violation of one man's property by another. A man's own premarital or extramarital activities were rarely a legal issue, as long as he didn't infringe upon the rights of another patriarch. For unmarried women of lower social status, the situation was more ambiguous. While not openly encouraged, it was a recognised reality of life, particularly in the bustling, often overcrowded urban centres. But this permissiveness came with a terrifying catch. A woman who became pregnant outside of marriage faced a grim future. Without a husband to claim the child, both she and her baby would be social outcasts, facing a life of destitution. This is where we uncover another startling aspect of their world: their pragmatic and surprisingly sophisticated approach to contraception and abortion. Medical texts describe a variety of methods. Women were advised to use concoctions of herbs and other substances inserted as a pessary to create a hostile environment for sperm. They used honey, known for its antibacterial properties, and acacia gum, which ferments into lactic acid, a known spermicide. They even understood that certain plants, when ingested, could induce a miscarriage. These weren't whispered back-alley remedies. They were documented medical practices. The goal was not moral judgment, but practical problem-solving. An unwanted pregnancy was a social and economic disaster, and their society provided tools, however rudimentary and dangerous, to manage that risk. This was not a world that saw sex through the lens of sin, but through the lens of social function. And when that function was threatened, they sought practical, not moral solutions. This pragmatism extended to areas of sexuality that later cultures would viciously condemn. Take, for example, homosexuality. Our modern categories of gay or straight simply didn't exist in the Mesopotamian mind. Their concern was not with the gender of one's sexual partner, but with the role one took in the act. In their deeply patriarchal world, the act of penetration was an assertion of dominance, of masculinity. Therefore, a man who took the active, penetrative role with another man was not seen as having diminished his own masculinity. He was simply asserting his social power. The shame and stigma were reserved for the man who took the receptive role, as this was seen as a feminizing act, a willing acceptance of a subordinate position. But even here there is a fascinating exception, and it once again leads us back to the temple. There existed a class of priests, the Asinu and the Kagaru, who were in service to the goddess Ishtar. These were individuals who we might today describe as transgender or gender fluid. They lived as women, dressed as women, and often took the receptive role in sexual rituals. But far from being outcasts, their status was sanctified. They were seen as liminal beings, existing in a sacred space between male and female. And their very existence was a tribute to the all-encompassing, gender-defying power of the goddess herself. In the temple, the normal rules of social hierarchy were suspended. The feminizing act became a holy one, another way of channeling the divine power of creation. They understood that human desire was a complex and multifaceted force, and they created a society with different rules for different spaces. The strict laws of the city maintained patriarchal order, while the fluid, chaotic rituals of the temple ensured the favour of the gods. But perhaps the most profound evidence of their complex view of sexuality comes from their most famous story, the world's first great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. For it is in this ancient tale of heroes, gods and monsters that we find one of the most remarkable characters in all of ancient literature, a woman who is both a prostitute and a saviour, a seductress and a civilizing force. Her name is Shamhat, and her story reveals the ultimate purpose of sex in the Mesopotamian worldview, not just as a tool for procreation or a form of worship, but as the very force that transforms a wild beast into a human being. To find her, we must travel to the edge of the known world, to the wild steppes where civilization gives way to untamed nature. And there, living among the animals, is a creature of hair and earth, a man named Enkidu. He is not yet a man as we would understand it. He is a force of nature, a being of pure instinct. He runs with the gazelles, drinks from the same waterholes, and his heart beats in time with the wild herd. He knows nothing of cities, of kings, of laws. He is humanity in its primordial state, innocent and untamed. But his very existence is a disruption. He frees the animals from a hunter's traps, undoing the work of man. The hunter, terrified and unable to ply his trade, goes to the great king of the city of Uruk, the mighty Gilgamesh, for a solution. And the solution Gilgamesh offers is perhaps the most Mesopotamian thing imaginable. He does not send a warrior to kill Enkidu. He does not send a wise man to reason with him. He sends a woman. He sends Shamhat, a harimtu, a sacred priestess of the temple of Ishtar. Her task is not to trick him or to trap him. Her task is to civilize him with her body. What happens next is described in breathtaking detail in the epic. Shamhat travels to the watering hole, and when Enkidu appears, she does not hide. She reveals her beauty, and the wild man who has never known a human woman is captivated. The text tells us they lay together for 6 days and 7 nights. This is not a fleeting sordid encounter. It is a profound and lengthy ritual of becoming. For 6 days and 7 nights, Shamhat initiates Enkidu into the world of humanity through the act of sex. And at the end of this period, something extraordinary happens. Enkidu, sated and changed, goes to rejoin his animal companions, but they no longer recognize him. The gazelles flee from his approach. The wild beasts of the steppe turn away from him. He has lost his connection to the natural world. He tries to run as he once did, but his knees fail him. His body is no longer that of a wild creature. The text tells us that, in that moment, he had gained something far more valuable than what he had lost. He had gained wisdom. He had grown in understanding. The sexual union with Shamhat had awakened his human consciousness. In the words of the epic, "You are beautiful, Enkidu. You are like a god." This is perhaps the most profound statement on sexuality ever recorded in ancient literature. The act that civilizes the wild man is not education, not law, not labour. It is sex. It is the intimate knowledge of another human being, shared through the body, that severs the connection to the animal world and births a fully conscious human. Shamhat is not a temptress leading a pure soul astray. She is the agent of civilization. Her sexuality is a sacred and powerful tool, the very force that transforms a beast of the field into a hero destined to walk beside kings. After their union, her role shifts from seductress to teacher. She clothes Enkidu. She teaches him to eat bread and drink beer, the staples of civilized life, which at first taste alien to him. She is the one who leads him out of the wilderness and towards the great city of Uruk. The entire foundation of human society, in this epic, is built upon a sexual awakening. This is a worldview so fundamentally different from our own that it can be difficult to grasp. We have spent millennia separating the sexual from the spiritual, building walls between the desires of the body and the aspirations of the mind. For the Mesopotamians, these were not separate realms. They were two sides of the same cosmic coin. The story of Shamhat and Enkidu is the mythical expression of the rituals happening in the temples. It provides the narrative justification, the cultural blueprint, for why sacred prostitution was not a degradation, but an act of creation. Shamhat did not simply have sex with Enkidu. She created him as a human being. But the story does not end there. For once, Enkidu, this newly minted man, arrives in the city of Uruk. The first thing he does is challenge its king, Gilgamesh, and their initial, violent confrontation blossoms into one of the most profound and moving love stories in all of literature. The bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is the central emotional core of the epic, a relationship of such intensity that it has led scholars to debate its nature for centuries. Was this a deep friendship? A bond of brothers in arms? Or was it a passionate romantic love between two men? The answer reveals yet another layer of the Mesopotamian sexual landscape, one that once again challenges our modern assumptions about love, gender, and desire. The bond that forms between Gilgamesh, the king who is 2/3 god and 1/3 man, and Enkidu, the wild man made human through the touch of a woman, is nothing short of electric. They do not meet as friends. They meet as rivals, locking in a furious, earth-shaking wrestling match in the streets of Uruk. It is a clash of equals, a test of strength and will that neither can definitively win. And in that stalemate, in that moment of mutual recognition of the other's power, their enmity dissolves and is reborn as a love of unparalleled intensity. The text itself offers tantalizing clues, using language that is both deeply emotional and, to our modern ears, profoundly ambiguous. Gilgamesh declares, "I will love him as a wife." When his mother interprets his dreams of Enkidu's arrival, she tells him, "You will love him and embrace him as a wife." They kiss, they hold hands, they travel together, they fight together, they sleep side by side under the stars. Their adventures are the stuff of legend. They journey to the cedar forest to slay the fearsome demon Humbaba. They defy the gods by killing the bull of heaven sent to destroy them. It is a bond forged in battle and sealed in brotherhood, a partnership of two souls who are each other's perfect counterpart. So what are we to make of this? How do we label a love so fierce it defies the categories of its own time? The truth is we can't, not with our modern vocabulary. To call them lovers in the modern sense is to impose a framework that simply didn't exist. As we've seen, Mesopotamian society was far more concerned with social roles and power dynamics than with the gender of one's partner. But the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu also defies the simple Mesopotamian binary of dominant and submissive. They are equals. Their bond is not one of conquest or ownership, but of deep, mutual affection and respect. It exists outside the rigid structures of both marriage contracts and temple rituals. It is a third way, a unique and powerful connection that the epic treats with the utmost seriousness and reverence. This relationship, in all its passionate complexity, is presented not as a transgression, but as the central, defining relationship of the hero's life. It is the love for Enkidu that makes Gilgamesh more than just a tyrannical king. It makes him human. And it is the loss of that love that shatters his world. As punishment for killing the bull of heaven, the gods decree that one of the two heroes must die. The lot falls to Enkidu. His death is not swift or heroic. It is a slow, agonizing decline from a mysterious illness, a wasting away that forces both men to confront the brutal reality of mortality. The description of Gilgamesh's grief is one of the most powerful passages in all of world literature. He weeps for him for 7 days and 7 nights, refusing to give up his body for burial, hoping his tears might bring him back to life, until a maggot falls from his friend's nostril. In that horrifying moment of finality, Gilgamesh is broken. He roars like a lioness robbed of her cubs. He tears at his hair and his fine royal robes. He abandons his throne, his city, his duties, and begins to wander the wild lands, his face etched with sorrow, his heart filled with a new and terrifying fear. It is not just the loss of his beloved friend that drives him. It is the sudden, stark realization of his own mortality. "Shall I not die too? Am I not like Enkidu?" he cries. This is the true turning point of the epic. The love for Enkidu and the unbearable grief of his loss sets Gilgamesh on a new, desperate quest, the quest for eternal life. He travels to the ends of the earth, facing impossible trials, and seeking out the one man who is said to have survived the Great Flood, Utnapishtim, in the hopes of learning the secret of immortality. The story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, therefore, is not merely a tale of heroic deeds or even of a profound love. It is a foundational myth about what it means to be human. It is their love that gives their lives meaning, and it is the loss of that love that forces Gilgamesh to confront the fundamental human condition, the knowledge that we all must die. In this epic, the most profound philosophical questions are born from the most intimate of human connections. The Mesopotamians were telling us that it is love, in all its forms, that awakens us, that civilizes us, and that ultimately forces us to seek a meaning that transcends our own fleeting existence. The epic gives us a vision of a same-sex love that is heroic, transformative, and central to the human story. But for every epic hero, there were a million ordinary people, living their lives not in the realm of myth, but under the watchful eye of the law. What happened when the desires of ordinary men and women strayed into territories that the law and the gods deemed unnatural? The chilling answers, found on tablets that detail everything from forbidden incantations to legal penalties, reveal the harsh reality that lay beneath the poetic ideal. For every Gilgamesh and Enkidu, whose love could be immortalized in epic verse, there were countless ordinary Mesopotamians whose desires, if acted upon, would lead not to legend, but to disgrace, punishment, and a swift, brutal end. The epic gives us the ideal, the mythic potential of love to transcend boundaries. But the legal tablets, the omen texts, and the magical incantations show us the grim reality of the boundaries themselves and the severe penalties for crossing them. This was a society that, for all its sacred celebrations of sexuality, lived in mortal terror of what it deemed unnatural. These were not sins in our modern religious sense. They were abominations, acts that tore at the very fabric of the cosmic order and invited the wrath of both gods and men. What constituted such a crime? Anything that deviated from the sacred purpose of procreation within the rigidly defined patriarchal structure. The most detailed prohibitions, unsurprisingly, revolved around men. While a man taking the dominant role with another man was often tolerated, for a man to willingly take the receptive role was a grave social transgression. It was seen as an abdication of his masculinity, a voluntary self-demotion to the status of a woman or a slave. Divination texts, which priests use to interpret omens, are filled with grim predictions for a man who lies with his male equal as with a wife, foretelling loss of status, ruin of his household, and the displeasure of the gods. Even more terrifying was the taboo against bestiality. To lie with an animal was to erase the sacred boundary between the human and the beast, to regress from the civilized state that Shamhat had so carefully bestowed upon Enkidu. It was an act of pure chaos, and the punishments were severe, often involving execution and the ritual purification of the land, which was believed to have been defiled by the act. Similarly, incest was a profound taboo, not because of a genetic understanding, but because it represented the ultimate corruption of the family unit, the very building block of their civilization. It twisted the clear lines of authority and lineage into a chaotic knot. And the penalties were designed to be absolute deterrents. A man who lay with his own daughter would be exiled from the city, cast out into the wilderness to become like the wild beasts himself. A son who lay with his mother would be burned alive. The severity of the punishment reflected the severity of the perceived crime against the natural order. And what of love between women? Here, the historical record falls into a chilling silence. The law codes, so meticulously detailed about the sexual conduct of men and the fidelity of wives, say almost nothing about women desiring other women. This silence is not a sign of acceptance, it is a sign of erasure. In a world where a woman's sexuality was defined entirely by her relationship to men, first her father, then her husband, the idea of a desire that existed completely outside of that framework was so alien it was barely conceivable. It didn't threaten the patriarchal line of succession, and so in the eyes of the law, it barely registered as an act at all. The true horror of the Mesopotamian system was not just in what it punished, but in what it refused to even acknowledge. It was a world that, in its relentless pursuit of order, left vast swathes of human experience unnamed and unrecorded, lost to the shadows between the lines of cuneiform. So we are left with this staggering portrait of a civilization at war with its own most fundamental drive. The people of ancient Mesopotamia gave us the first cities, the first laws, the first stories. They looked to the heavens and mapped the stars, seeking order in the cosmos. And yet on Earth, they were locked in a constant, desperate struggle to contain the chaotic, creative, and terrifying power of human sexuality. They channeled it through sacred rituals, constrained it with brutal laws, celebrated it in passionate poetry, and fought it with magical incantations. They saw it as the source of all life and the potential cause of all ruin. From the sacred priestess in the temple to the wild man in the steppes, from the king on his throne to the unnamed woman waiting for a stranger's coin, sex was the current that ran beneath everything, the great, untamable river that both nourished and threatened to destroy the fragile civilization they had built upon its banks. Their story is a reminder that the human struggle to understand and control our own desires is not a modern invention, but a drama as old as civilization itself, an epic written not just on tablets of clay, but in the very heart of what it means to be human.